The story of Israel in Numbers has become, as we've seen, a story of rebellion. It's going to happen again today, and today won't be the last time. But this is perhaps the most shocking one, as even Moses himself now gets caught up in it. And so this is a pretty challenging story we have to look at here. We have to understand it as well as we can. What it was that he did wrong and why it was so serious. Such a problem that he ends up being punished the way that he is for it. And then from that, we have to also understand what it then means for us. That we have to learn that God is holy, and he demands to be treated as though he's holy. He demands to be believed. And so we have to know what it means to believe him, because we can't achieve his standard otherwise. So this is found in Numbers chapter 20. If you've made your way there in your Bibles, you're set. If not, though, now would be the time to do that, or to grab one from the shelf, pull out your phone, and search for Numbers 20, however you want to get there. We're going to start with the first verse, and for now looking at just the first verse. It says that the children of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed in Kadesh. And Miriam died there and was buried there. And so this is the setting for the story, and there's three details essentially that were given. First of all, location. That Israel is in the wilderness of Zin at Kadesh. That maybe doesn't sound like it means too much of anything, but it does refer to an earlier detail, because it means that they're back on the border of the Promised Land. This was actually the place where they were when the spies were sent into Canaan to scout it out, and so this is where they were when they refused to go into Canaan and then received the punishment of 40 years wandering in the wilderness. Then we're also given a time frame that this occurs in the first month. We're not told what year, but we don't need to be. Because the fact that they are back here, and then also the fact that everything that follows from this point forward, including the rest of the book of Numbers, and then all of the book of Deuteronomy, and then the start of the book of Joshua, makes it clear that this is the 40th year. And so this is at the end of their period of wandering. The entire time of it just really goes without mention at all. It's not discussed in the book of Numbers. The only thing of it that is the rebellion of Korah that we looked at last week, that was right after their initial refusal. Roy Gaines says that this entire period of time, it's just dull decades of death in the desert. That's his turn of phrase for it, which is a good one. We just get no description of the things that happened. And then the last part of the setting is the emotional aspect, because we have the death of Miriam. And so this whole period of dying in the desert, it now includes her as well, one of the leaders of Israel, and also, of course, the older sister of Moses and Aaron. Now, there's no indication in the Bible that she refused to enter the Promised Land, that she was part of that rebellion. But still, the fact that she died in the wilderness does suggest that there was some type of judgment involved. And so more than likely, this does go back to her attempted coup against Moses back in Numbers chapter 12. That is why she, too, is not allowed to enter. And so she gets that close, basically, but then is refused. And so she has died. Israel has lost her help. Moses has lost her help. And that is what affects everyone's mood and sets the stage for what follows. Now reading from verse chapter 2. It says that there was no water for the congregation. So they gathered together against Moses and Aaron, and the people contended with Moses, and spoke, saying, "If only we had died when our brethren died before the Lord. Why have you brought up the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, that we and our animals should die here? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is not a place of grain, or figs, or vines, or pomegranates, nor is there any water to drink." And so Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the door of the tabernacle of meeting, and they fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. So we do need to take into consideration here the reason why the Israelites are complaining. This wasn't boredom. This wasn't a power trip like some of the other rebellions that we've seen. This was because of water. Water in the desert is a reasonable concern, all right? So it's understandable that they would be worried about this. The nature of their complaint is what's not reasonable. Because, first of all, they contrast themselves with Moses and Aaron by calling themselves the assembly of the Lord. So they're basically saying, we're holy, and so you, as a result, are evil for leading us into this dangerous situation. Then on top of that, They bring up Egypt favorably, again, like they've done in the past, and then finally say that they would have been better off dying 40 years earlier during the plague that followed the punishment of Korah. And so that does mean also the people who are complaining are mostly the first generation, those who are left from that group. They're saying we should have died with our brothers at that time. We would have been better off than having to deal with this. And so that's what's unreasonable. And they are being unreasonable because they're forgetful. God has always supplied their needs. So they should have remembered his past provision in order to have faith in the present, a lesson that we all continually need to learn. But so here we go again. They're complaining. And Moses and Aaron go to the tabernacle and they fall on their faces in order to pray to God. And once more, the cloud of his glory descends. And we've seen judgment follow from that before. And it does, but things don't follow the pattern that we're used to at this point. As we return to the passage in verse 7, it says that the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the rod. You and your brother Aaron gather the congregation together. Speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water. Thus you shall bring water for them out of the rock, and give drink to the congregation and their animals." So Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock. And he said to them, "Hear now, you rebels. Must we bring water for you out of this rock?" And then Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod. And water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their animals drank. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not believe me, to hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them." So that is what's shocking here, but we need to go back first of all to also see that it's surprising how the Lord responds to the complaints of Israel. Because he doesn't speak in judgment against them, because he knows that they do actually need the water. And so he simply provides it. Now, does do so, of course, miraculously, because it's going to come from a rock. And so he tells Moses and Aaron to take the rod. He doesn't explain what the rod is. To them, it must have been obvious, and probably what it was, because it's mentioned that it's in the presence of the Lord, it would have been in front of the Ark of the Covenant. It was the rod of Aaron that had budded that we saw last week, because that was the sign of God's choice and his authority to make all the choices and his power to carry all the choices out. And so that was a symbol of him and what he says goes, that they were supposed to take out and then speak to the rock. Now, for water to come out of a rock, this is also a miracle that's been performed before. In Exodus chapter 17 is where that happens first, when the Israelites are at Mount Sinai and also were complaining for water. And so God had done this previously, and so he's doing this on purpose in order to tie back to that, to say that he's just as trustworthy here as he was there, just as trustworthy now as he had been then, that they should be looking to him and having faith in him. But in this moment, Moses reaches his breaking point. His sister's just died. He just buried her. And they're getting ready finally for the push into Canaan after 40 years of waiting for nothing, really. And so the stress of that movement and finally being there, and then the people again are attacking him. He can't stand it anymore. And he lashes out. And he makes a number of mistakes as a result. His first error is in speaking to the people rather than to the rock. Now, of course, he had to say something to them. He had to tell them why they were gathered together. But as he's talking and he's looking out over their miserable faces, is how he sees them at this point after 40 years of dealing with them, that his emotion just overcomes him. And what he says to them is taking credit. Must we bring water? That's what he says. He says he's going to be the one to perform this. He wasn't supposed to do anything. He was merely supposed to ask. But what he does do is to hit the rock instead. And actually to do it again for good measure, just once more to show how angry he is. Now God, for his part, still provides the water because again, he knew what the Israelites needed. But he doesn't just overlook this. Moses and Aaron are punished. Now they share in the fate of the first generation. They also will be forbidden from entering Canaan. Now from our perspective, this really feels like overkill. This is not the same as what the rest of the Israelites did. Yes, Moses technically disobeyed the commandment that he was given, but striking the rock was also something that he'd done before. And so there seems like a pretty natural connection between one event and the other. And then we have to ask on top of that, why punish Aaron at all? He doesn't do anything here. But God does explain it. He says that they're being punished because they didn't believe him. To believe the Lord is to actually take what he says seriously enough to do it. Disobedience is a lack of faith. And they showed a lack of faith by relying on themselves, by taking credit instead of hallowing the Lord, treating him as holy. And we also have to understand the connection to that earlier event in Exodus chapter 17. Because there, God said to Moses to strike the rock while his cloud was hovering over it. And so that was a symbol. It was supposed to identify him with the rock, to say, just as Moses is hitting this, so you are striking me with your complaints, Israel, and it needs to stop. And so that was why he had established that miracle that way. He doesn't do that here. This is really more about just turning to him in faith. Moses, though, is the one who turns it into an assault. He chooses on his own this time to attack the Lord. That's how it would have been understood. That's why this is so serious. And of course, I'm talking about Moses, but it really is they, not simply he. It's Aaron too, because he didn't try to stop Moses. He was along for the ride. He was in complete agreement with this. Once more the follower, as he had so often been, and now with these disastrous consequences. And he's the first to face them. That's what the last portion of what we'll read from Numbers today says. Chapter 20, starting in verse 22. Now the children of Israel, the whole congregation, journeyed from Kadesh and came to Mount Hor. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in Mount Hor by the border of the land of Edom, saying, Aaron shall be gathered to his people, for he shall not enter the land which I have given to the children of Israel, because you rebelled against my word at the water of Meribah. Take Aaron and Eleazar his son, bring them up to Mount Hor, and strip Aaron of his garments and put them on Eleazar his son. For Aaron shall be gathered to his people and die there. So Moses did just as the Lord commanded, and they went up to Mount Hor in the sight of all the congregation. Moses stripped Aaron of his garments and put them on Eleazar his son, and Aaron died there on the top of the mountain. And then Moses and Eleazar came down from the mountain. And now when all the congregation saw that Aaron was dead, all the house of Israel mourned for Aaron 30 days. So Aaron had been told that he wouldn't enter the promised land, and he does not. And when they reach this area now, Mount Hor, he's told by God, as is Moses, that it is time, and he is going to die. And so there are preparations that need to be made for that. And they are made in the sight of the people in order to let them know what's going on, but then carried out in private. That Aaron and his son Eleazar go up with Moses to the top of the mountain, and then Aaron's vestments, the uniform of the high priestly office, they are taken off of him and then transferred to his oldest surviving son. And then God kept his word, and he died. But it's also important to note that Aaron is not treated like the other rebels, because it says here actually twice that he was gathered to his people. And even to some extent, we have this with Miriam as well, with the mention of the fact that she was buried. Now, none of Aaron's people were here on Mount Hor. None of his ancestors, no one else from the nation of Israel was in this physical location. So that has more meaning than a burial place. It's talking about the fact that he's going to be gathered in their presence, that he's going to see them again. This is a statement about the afterlife and the fact that he has a place in it, which again is also at least implied by what happened to Miriam, as opposed to everybody else who God had cursed by saying that they were going to rot in the desert, just be left wherever they fell, in order to represent the fact that they had no place with him at all. Aaron does. Even in judgment, God's mercy to him is greater because, in spite of his failings, ultimately, he did have faith in God. It faltered at points. That's what's led him here. But still, it was God who was going to hold him up in the end. And now after Moses and Eleazar now come down from the mountain, and they're alone. The people realize, yes, Aaron is actually dead, and so they mourn for him. And they do so for an unusually long time. 7 days was what was normal. And that was actually what the people had done when Miriam had leprosy, that living death. And they waited for her during that time of her cleansing. Now they do it for a whole month. And so it does go to show, in those 40 years, in spite of the problems that they had experienced before, the people had really come to love Aaron, and especially those members of the second generation, because all of their parents, most of them by this point, were, of course, gone. But eventually the 30 days did come to an end, and they moved on, which is the point of this. It's the point of Eleazar taking over. There's a new generation. They are rising, and they are poised now to begin the mission that their parents had refused to take. And so that for Israel is the lesson, is that God does demand holiness, but he's still taking them where they need to go. It's also a lesson for us, but one of the things that we need to focus on the most is just the challenge of this passage, to come back to that, because it really is. We can still question the fairness of this. Why punish Moses to this extent? Because he's going to be next. And that actually won't be until the end of the book of Deuteronomy, but eventually it's going to happen to him, just the same as to Aaron and to Miriam. Why punish Aaron at all? Is it fair? The truth is that yes, it is exactly, terrifyingly fair. Because it's a question of fairness. It's a question of justice. It's a question of God's holiness. Because he's the point of comparison. And his holiness is absolute. He has no flaws, no imperfections, no failings of any sort. And he is the standard against which we are all held, because we were created in his image. And so to fail of that is to demand judgment. We think that this is a struggle? What about the first human sin of all? All Adam and Eve did was eat a piece of fruit, and it led to death and judgment for everyone. Because any single transgression against God's will is an assault on his glory. It is to strike him. And that's why James says in James chapter 2, verse 10, whoever shall keep the whole law and yet stumble in just one point, he's guilty of all. It doesn't matter what it is, how seemingly small it is to us, because that's not the point. The point is how great he is. And even Moses, as great as Moses was from a human point of view, even he couldn't redeem himself in the eyes of God. If he couldn't, we certainly can't. We cannot rely on ourselves. That is why it is so necessary to understand what it means to actually believe God. Because believing God means turning to him for our provision. That's the way that Jesus presents his own ministry. A few places that I pulled from the book of John for this. First of all, John chapter 4, verses 13 and 14, where it says that Jesus answered a woman that he was speaking to at a well and said, whoever drinks of this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water springing up into everlasting life. And then we can tie that to what he says in John chapter 7, verses 37 and 38. If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. He who believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. The miracle of what Christ did was to bring life out of the death and the emptiness of our stony hearts. That was what he came to do. But that meant that he had to be struck for us. And so that was what he submitted himself to. His blood poured out so that our guilt and our imperfection and our unholiness could be overcome. We're saved by his sacrifice and his resurrection when we admit our need for that salvation and believe in him. Because that's what it means. To turn to what God has done, and what he demands is to rely on Christ. And then from that point forward, we are to live to glorify him with the life that he gives us forever, starting now. Knowing that change that has taken place, our contention with God, that was so bad for Israel, so bad even for Moses and Aaron, it has been taken away. That's what Paul says in Romans chapter 5, verse 10. If when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. That's the hope. If you are looking for that, you don't know where you stand with God, but you're trying to find him, this is where. Understanding that you're not Moses. You have to ask yourself, everyone needs to ask themselves this question. If you were to die today and stand in the presence of God, and he were to ask you why he should let you into heaven, what would your answer be? Just honestly, as you think about that to yourself right now. If it's any form of, I've been pretty good, you're not getting in. Because you haven't been. Not in comparison to him, and that's the point. Even Moses fell short. But Jesus rose. And he's the one who provides that hope. You were the reason why he was struck, but he took on that death in order to save you from it. So trust in him to find the only source of life. He alone provides it. And if you have that decision to make, you can come forward if anyone is here. If you're at home watching this and you make that decision, let us know. We will be so overjoyed to hear it. But for those of you who have believed, we have to keep coming back to this water as well. God's people still have a lot to learn. We still face consequences when we falter. Ultimately, though, we know that God is providing for us because we're depending on Christ, not on ourselves. So do that, living out the life that he's pouring out in you. And remember that there is more than enough to go around. So share his love with those who are thirsting for it.